You hear a lot of educators say that, we need to disrupt. Disruption is temporary. If you think about a classroom educator and you have a student that is identified as disruptive, what's happened? You had something that was normalized, they changed that, and then you go through the effort and allocation of resources, whether it be human capital or anything else, to prevent that disruption from continuing and then reorient things back to what preceded that. My whole thing is that there are things that are antiquated and that are normalized within education that a simple disruption does nothing more than the equivalent of a remix. They need to be completely dismantled.
I am so honored to be the person who gets to talk with you because, Ken, we are very close friends and I know your message. And I want to talk a little bit about something I heard you talk about yesterday, which was what's the word you say? You're not disrupting, you're breaking down everything. So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so I consider myself a degree of a word nerd.
Yeah, you are.
I embrace that. So I wear it as a badge of honor. And I think for us in education, we tend to use a lot of descriptors and a lot of acronyms that um, they can do two things. One, first of all, the words are used and there's no definitions provided within context. And then also, when you start to really scrutinize language, you realize that sometimes the words that you use, because that's what's been normalized, are not aligned with the end result that you want. And so I shared yesterday in the talk that I happened to be able to do after you when you talked about TikTok, which, by the way, I thought was fantastic. Is the whole idea around, you hear a lot of educators say that, we need to disrupt. And so part of what I shared, so for the audience, part of what I shared is the fact that disruption is temporary. If you think about a classroom educator and you have a student that is identified as disruptive, what's happened? You had something that was normalized, they changed that, and then you go through the effort and allocation of resources, whether it be human capital or anything else, to prevent that disruption from continuing and then reorient things back to what preceded that. My whole thing is that there are things that are antiquated and that are normalized within education that a simple disruption does nothing more than the equivalent of a remix. They need to be completely dismantled. And I couple that with the whole idea around, you hear a lot of folks use the word reimagine. You can't reimagine something that you haven't completely torn down. If you think about it in terms of like a building, how can I reimagine a different structure while keeping the existing structure? It has to be completely torn down. And so that's why I always share with educators to just be mindful of the fact that some things do not need to be disrupted, they need to be dismantled.
And a lot of the work that you're doing is around that, and you do that with school districts. And what are you seeing happening at school districts in terms of that? Are people able to do that? Are there structures and things in the way that are stopping that? What's happening when you're out there?
A lot.
Yeah.
First of all, that's why, as was shared in my bio, that's why I tend to prefer to do more policy level work. Or, if when possible, I tend to request, require, urge, encourage for the work that I do around organizational leadership to include policy level work. So a lot of the things I've done with districts that are around diversity, equity, inclusion, and organizational change includes the school board. Because ultimately, not to discredit, diminish, or devalue what teachers do, policy and what the board says and what the executive cabinet says, that's your guardrails. And unfortunately, I had to operate within those guardrails during my time in the classroom. I'm old enough to remember back when all of us were promoting and pitching people to use technology in education. But the thing around that is, unless you get it co-signed by the site administrator or some district level person to even acquire that technology, no matter how much you think it's going to work, you're not going to get it. And so for me, it really is looking at what are the existing policies that either reinforce or create inequities that are perpetuated and then operationalized by the actions of the people. And that's why I always say it's a multi-tiered approach. You got to look at people, policy, and practice. So what I am seeing, first of all, one of the things that you heard me mention in the talk, so for the audience, one of the things I brought up in my talk yesterday is that grading, the antiquated systems of grading that we have need to be dismantled. The grading does nothing more than to sort and stratify students. It is not a meaningful feedback mechanism, and it does not represent learning, period. Anytime you attach a letter, you oversimplify the totality of the learning experience when you summate it down simply to a letter. So what I'm seeing, one, Anytime you're troubling a narrative and you're looking at dismantling antiquated systems, there's going to be resistance. People like what's safe, comfortable, and familiar, even if it doesn't benefit them, because they know what to expect. The added layer to that is when you start to interrogate things like grading and ask yourself the right questions. Like I brought it up in the talk yesterday, something as simple as, why do we use a 100-point scale? If you think about how it's traditionally used, again, antiquated, 59 of those 100 points represent failure. Why is a majority pretty much a significant majority of that scale, failure? And then even if you really break it down and you say, okay, well, the other score ranges, those can be successful. I disagree with that vehemently. Your margin of success is really only 90 to 100, which is 11 percentage points. So now let's look at that 100-point scale. You're really saying only 11% of the learners that operate within this scale will be successful. Most educators would look at that from that perspective and say, well, that's not equitable, and that's not aligned with empowering learners. It's not aligned with doing any of those things. So the whole idea is to really start to interrogate things that we've done because we, quote unquote, have always done them, and ask yourself, how is this creating inequities by design? How is it stratifying students? How is it denying access and opportunity for students to be able to realize their full potential? You are seeing a lot of districts starting to really look at their grading practices. One of the other areas that I really push for are accessibility to what I define as higher academically rigorous programs, and that usually is visualized in honors and AP level classes. Full disclosure, I'm not an advocate for the AP curriculum or AP exams and AP courses because ultimately the courses are test prep. I am for the rigor of the environment that supports higher order thinking, critical and analytical thought, and ways in which students can be pushed appropriately and academically. So what I'm seeing in that regard are things like, what are the enrollment practices? How are you supporting and encouraging students, especially students of a historically excluded and marginalized background, to take those classes? You and I know each other very well. I share in one of my keynotes that I was at a high school that was 25% black students, yet I was the only black male student in all of my AP and honors level classes for all 4 years I was in high school. The minimum what that high school should have done is said that the percentage representation in those classes should be commensurate to the percentage representation of the campus. So there's a lot of things that are going on, whether it's in our dialogue or actualized in shifts in policy and along those lines that's happening. But of course, nothing of anything meaningful shift is not going to occur without resistance. And most of the resistance is usually out of a myopic perspective, significant implicit biases, more specifically bandwagon effect and confirmation bias. And so that's why, for me, it's the importance of the work and to have the right impact. And I know that, yes, you do have to work with classroom practitioners, but you also have to be more, you have to also analyze the policies that may be reinforcing or encouraging the behaviors that you're seeing in the practitioner.
And to be able to do that, I would say, just from our conversations that we have a lot, you have to have the right people at the table. This has to be a diverse population at the table, or you're not going to understand the needs of the diversity.
Correct. And and to add another layer to that, just for full disclosure, I have no problem with people that are opposed to some degree, that's sitting at the table for that dialogue. The key, which I've been able to develop mechanisms that are pretty good now, the key is to discern the difference between the good faith actors and the bad faith actors. The bad faith actors are going to be resistant despite and no matter what new information comes up that will force them to examine their existing beliefs. Those are the bad faith actors. They're not interested in hearing it, they just don't want it because either one, they significantly benefit from it, or two, it'll force them to examine themselves. The good faith actors are the ones that said, I don't agree, but I'm willing to listen.
And we've seen that at board meetings that you've been at. When you are, so maybe you can speak a little bit about some of the resistance that you have faced at boards across the nation.
Across the country,
And also after that, the part where you involve students in this change.
So usually when I do my organizational change work, the perfect scenario that I always encourage executive cabinets is I work with a cohort of classroom practitioners, coaches, and site administrators. Then I also work with what I call a community partnership group, which the community partnership group involves students, members of that cohort, and members of the community. Because I'm a big believer in building community, and you have to involve community members in the discussion and, quite frankly, in the work. And part of the reason why I'm pretty insistent upon that is because the work that I do with districts is going to be temporary/finite. I don't live in those communities, and I'm not going to stay there. But my main approach around it is the work has to be sustainable. How do I want to be able to ensure that the work will continue to evolve and grow long after I'm gone? You mentioned the student group. I love working with what I call student advocacy and empowerment groups. It's students that are giving us a clear window into their experiences in the classroom, the hallways of the campus, the activities they're involved in. The student voice those are the three pillars. And quite frankly, I don't like to speak in absolutes and say the whole, this is non-negotiable. But when I engage in the dialogue around the importance of involving the student voice in this, and when I say student voice, not me speaking for the students being supported to assert their own agency with this, then supporting the classroom practitioners, then both of those are also a part of that community partnership. That's where you get the degrees of sustainability among many things. And yes, so in that work, there's always going to be the resistance. I can go into details about it, but there are things from comments that have been made about me in public comment and board meetings, appearing in a local paper, appearing in local television programming, and all those things. But what I will say is that more often than not, there are members of the community whose voices are aligned with the purpose of the work and the intentionality and the reasons behind the work. They now become galvanized, and they also speak up. And that's why I said, as someone who's opposed, I don't believe in closing the door. I believe in providing, again, discerning good faith versus bad faith actors and including them in the process. And I will say that pretty much every single time we've involved folks that are opposed to it, as the process evolves, and I always say you need to give yourself a chance to understand why this work is important before you recognize the larger scope or the larger goal. You need to recognize that all of us, it's a poem that I always share in my workshop. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow as one of the line. So how are you going to take ownership over your learning? How are you going to recognize and give yourself the grace and the space that you have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow? You want to operate from I'm getting new information that will put me in a position to simply learn and grow, not I'm getting new information that I'm going to receive as I'm a bad person and I'm guilting and shaming. I don't, that is not conducive for growth. And so despite the resistance that I get, that in some cases is pretty strong, you get several things that happen in that. One is, with many of the districts I work with, many of those students will now go speak up in the board meeting. And it's a beautiful thing to watch, because it's something where it makes me feel good, because what I have done is I have simply been the catalyst to say, here's our pathway. And I'll use a Star Wars reference. I'm Yoda and they're Luke Skywalker. I'm not going to tell you how it works. I'm going to support you in identifying what gifts you have and how to utilize those gifts to amplify your agency and your voice and use it in the appropriate venues. They don't need me. My goal is to support you through facilitation to do that. But that also happens with many of those community members, and I've seen many. I've gotten lots of emails, messages on LinkedIn, and even personal comments where there are folks that were resistant when we started, and then they start to examine their own lived experience, their own perspective, their own viewpoints, and how is that. Why were you opposed? What did you expect? How is this different? How will you utilize that growth going forward to engage in dialogue within your respective circles in the community? Support, the executive cabinet or the school board in continuing this work. Support the school board in adopting definitive policies that support this work. Because ultimately, and again, that's why I always say it's truly a community endeavor. The school is the hub of the community, but you have to involve the community in that. And that's why I'm not opposed to folks to being a part of that process that don't understand or are against the work at the start, as long as they're willing to operate in good faith, which is you're going to take ownership of your learning, you're going to contribute to the dialogue, you're going to be transparent about what you're opposed to, why you're opposed to it, and how does your growth within that perspective, how is it aligned with the end result goal, which the main goal is to ensure that the learner experience is one of which they are seen, heard, and loved in the schools. That's it.
I'm curious your perspective about this moment nationally post remote teaching that was induced by the pandemic. If you see that potentially a silver lining of the pandemic and this mass disruption is that it is an opportune moment historically to be able to reconstruct education. I'm curious if you're seeing people sort of embracing that on a national level, or if you're seeing actually kind of a backlash to it, a sort of retreat back to the way that we did things, and that in some ways we've perhaps taken a step back in certain places, and sort of how you're addressing that.
So yeah, that's a good point. I see the attempts to reconstruct in pockets. I also see, I always say it's for historical context. It's the pendulum of our social mores and our social narratives. Every time there's progress is made, there's a vehement effort to push it back the other way, and it's a constant swinging back and forth of that pendulum. The thing that the remote learning did, that COVID did, is it forced people to see what they were, quite frankly, they had the privilege of not having to see. And so what I am seeing is a much more collective effort around things like, how do we ensure at the policy level ubiquitous broadband access? I shouldn't be able to go to certain zip codes throughout the country and not have broadband access, not have cell phone access. That to me in and of itself is it's not even a digital divide, it's what I call it's a digital impoverishment. Because what you're doing is it's not just you don't have access. If we're at a tech conference, we know tech. Think about, I take away your accessibility. I'm not just taking away your email. I'm taking away your banking. I'm taking away your opportunity for learning. Holly has a phenomenal talk on like TikTok. I'm taking away your opportunity for microlearning. I'm taking away your opportunity to be creator and posting. I'm taking away your opportunity for entrepreneurship. I think that the more you see the access become ubiquitous, you will see that zip code is no longer a barrier towards you realizing things like, oh, I want to start an online business. I want to be able to, I have friends that are administrators in rural districts, and I always ask, look, if you had broadband access, how might that empower some of the students in your school district to say, I don't have to leave my community in order to do fill in the blank? Like that, and think about what it can do for localized economies. I've had the privilege of speaking in a lot of areas around the country where I see the decline in the local economy because either people are leaving those communities or they're not moving into those communities. And so that's why for me, I can give a definitive micro and macro economic argument as to why you need to have broadband access be ubiquitous. Then you add that into the schooling environment where, it's how does access provide opportunity, and opportunity should be infinite and limitless, and your socioeconomic status and your geography should not be barriers to that. So you are seeing that because that's something that everyone can get behind. That's where I always talk about diversity, is that it's a lot less about altruism and a lot more about interest convergence. And it's also not limited to the optics, not limited to one component of our identity. That's one where social class it affects a lot of people across many different race, language, ability, all those factors. So you are seeing a push around that, but you're also seeing a resistance to, no, I want things to be what they were, due in no small part to, I and or my children significantly benefit from it. And then for me, I always shift that dialogue to, do you believe that equity is a zero-sum game? Do you believe that I have to take something from you and give it to somebody else in order for true equity to be in place? And you see, and then of course, again, I want to engage, I'm going to ask the questions, I want to engage in a dialogue. And again, that's one of my tactics, or I won't tactics, but that's one of my ways that I protect my energy to discern a bad faith actor from a good faith. A good faith actor will say, oh, I haven't thought about that. Now we can engage in a dialogue. A bad faith actor will say, I don't know and I don't care. This is what I believe and I'm sticking to it and I'm not gonna do it. That's a bad faith actor. So there's going to be resistance no matter what. There's a Frederick Douglass quote, there is no progress without struggle. And I equate struggle to our collective efforts around, we see things that many others don't, and how are we going to build a coalition to see those things operationalized, actualized, and be a part of our evolution and honestly in the human condition, period.
A couple of years ago, actually at the last conference that we had here in New Orleans, Creative Constructor Lab, I heard you give a keynote talk about Tequity. And one of the things that you highlight is that it's not just about devices. Oftentimes we are thinking about broadband, we're thinking about access to one-to-one computers. We're also thinking about, or we need to think about, what we're having students do with those devices,
right.
that they are creating with those devices, that they are actually engaged with, like you said, rigorous activities. It seems like we have perhaps gotten a little bit closer to getting one-to-one, to getting broadband, and that a next major hurdle is how do we get educators to not just put a computer in front of a student and have them go on like a game or a personalized learning program where they're essentially just learning via the computer. So
right.
What are you doing when you're working with districts? How are you suggesting that they can also put in place some practices, some programs to get students to engage in this project-based learning, the kind of real rigorous creation with technology that I know you advocate for?
Yeah, I thank you for asking that question. It's a brilliant question. So my default in a scenario like that, and this points back to what Holly asked earlier around the policy. My first default question is, what has been your professional growth plan over the last 1, 3, and 5 years? It's very easy, and this is something I want to be crystal clear to the audience on. It's very easy, and I quite frankly, I call it the cheap way out. It's very easy to default to placing the blame on the classroom educators. You cannot blame a teacher if they've never been afforded the access and the opportunity to engage in a professional growth around using the devices in the first place. So that's the first part. So I always ask the question, what was your professional growth plan a year ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago? What's in the strategic plan that is aligned with supporting the growth of educators in not just the acquisition and implementation of the devices, but how those devices are being used? How is that growth plan sustainable? I always share, you want to focus on sustainability before you get to scalability. Then, when I work with teachers, it's what are the programs, resources, and supports that you need in order to support students around higher order thinking? I will define higher order thinking. Using their existing gifts and skills and growing those where technology is a necessary and critical conduit towards realizing their full potential. Developing critical and analytical skills within relevance of the content, doing it in ways that it is appropriately individualized but appropriately scaffolded as well. So for example, instead of having students, let's say, write a poem, we're going to look at a bunch of different poems, we're going to do a deeper analysis of what was the disposition of the author, what is the message that's obvious, what are some of the hidden messages, how do we use language in a strategic capacity to convey a story when you have a limited amount of words or space to be able to do that? Let's look at the structure of all the different structures of poetry. Let's define poetry in a cultural context. Have you seen poetry that's relevant to your cultural identity? Bring that into the dialogue. How does culture impact and how do our experiences impact the ways in which we write poetry? One of my favorite ways I used to do that was using music and using the lyrics. I would literally show lyrics of a song and I would say, you all should know that songs is poetry, technically. And I go, but I want you to see it and I want you to analyze the context of the writing of it and everything else. And once you do that, now you've done that analysis. Now I can go into the creative aspect and say, okay, now that I've built this background knowledge, how do I use that and apply my lens to it? That would be an example of it. And of course, my favorite thing, how could you involve technology in that? You not just write it, but then you record a video and you recite it.
Connects with your work and pressing record and adding the metacognitive element after you've done creation to get students to actually reflect back on their work. So it's a perfect through line back to our conversation on Monday.
And now you know why we love working together so much, for the very reason you just said.
Absolutely.
See, we have different viewpoints to the same learning and experiential outcome. And that's the beauty of being able to do that. If Holly does it alone or if I do it alone, we're going to have an impact. But I always say you want to have an arrangement or a situation where ideally the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Well, Ken, I know you're sticking around for the next panel. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks so much for coming to this live stream here at ISTE 2022 in New Orleans, and we'll see you in a moment.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.